In the ancient Near East, the corpse was the ultimate epicenter of contamination. According to Levitical law, human remains possessed the highest degree of ritual impurity, a status known in the ancient Hebrew tradition as Avi Avot Hatuma, the father of fathers of impurity. To touch a bone, a grave, or a lifeless body was to absorb the stain of death itself, severing a person from the presence of the divine sanctuary until a rigorous, multi-day process of purification could be completed. Death was an absolute quarantine. It was the great devourer, the final period at the end of human existence, possessing a dark gravity that only pulled downward. Life could not be born from the grave only consumed. Yet, buried deep within the historical records of the Book of Kings, is a chilling anomaly that shatters this fundamental architecture of reality. It is an event that breaks every physical law of thermodynamics, defies the biological certainty of decay, and violates the strictest codes of ancient Israelite theology. The text is found in the second book of Kings, chapter 13. The year is violent, marked by the cyclical bloodshed of the ancient Levant. The scripture explicitly notes that Moabite raiders used to invade the land at the spring of the year. This was not a formal, organized military siege orchestrated by a conquering empire. These were rapid, terrifying incursions. Marauding bands crossed the Jordan River as the weather warmed, striking unprotected Israelite villages, slaughtering farmers, and stealing the harvest. It is in the midst of this seasonal terror that a funeral procession is abruptly interrupted. A group of Israelites is hastily attempting to bury a man. We do not know his name, his lineage, or the specific cause of his death. We only know that his mourning party is suddenly gripped by absolute panic. They look up and see the dust of a Moabite raiding party rising on the horizon. The enemy is closing in fast, and they are bringing the sword. There is no time to carve out a new sepulchre, no time to roll a heavy stone over a personalized tomb, and certainly no time to complete the sacred rites of mourning. Desperation overrides dignity. In their frantic terror to escape the incoming slaughter, the pallbearers carry the lifeless body to the nearest open cavern and blindly hurl the corpse inside. They do not realize whose tomb they have desecrated. This burial cave belongs to Elisha, the most formidable and terrifying prophet of the northern kingdom. This was the man who had commanded bears to maul his mockers, who had blinded entire Syrian armies with a single prayer, and who had manipulated the elemental properties of water and iron. But Elisha is long gone. The scripture coldly states in verse 20 that Elisha died, and they buried him. Years have passed. His flesh has completely rotted away. All that remains in the suffocating darkness of that limestone cave is a pile of dry, silent bones. By every law of nature and ancient theology, this is a tomb of ultimate defilement. But as the anonymous corpse is thrown into the dark, its lifeless limbs violently strike the skeletal remains of the prophet. What happens next is recorded in verse 21, in a singular sentence that remains one of the most enigmatic and deeply unsettling records in the entire biblical canon. The text reads, "And when the man was let down and touched the bones of Elisha, he revived and stood up on his feet." There is no prayer uttered. There is no invocation of the divine name. There is no living prophet standing nearby to stretch out his hands over the dead, acting as a conduit for the Spirit of God. There is only a rotting corpse colliding with a dry skeleton in the pitch blackness of an underground crypt. This is a terrifying mechanical transfer of power. It suggests that the ancient Hebrew concept of ruach, the breath, the wind, the active spirit of God, had so thoroughly saturated the physical matter of Elisha's body during his life that a residual, highly volatile layer of divine energy lingered in the marrow of his dead bones. Like a dormant nuclear reactor buried beneath the earth, the tomb of Elisha was still emitting a frequency of life so concentrated that it violently reversed the biological process of decomposition upon mere physical contact. The dead man's heart restarts. Oxygen floods collapsed lungs. Rigor mortis is instantly broken. He opens his eyes in the dark, breathing, standing upright over the skeleton that just resurrected him. This event forces us to confront a horrifying and magnificent reality about the nature of divine power. It is not merely a vaporous, abstract concept floating in the heavens. It has mechanics. It has physical weight. It can anchor itself to human calcium and outlast the decay of the grave. If you seek the hidden truths of the ancient world, if you are drawn to the suppressed mechanics of the supernatural and the architectural secrets of the biblical text, subscribe and join us in this investigation. The story of Elisha's posthumous miracle is not a quaint historical footnote about God's lingering favor. It is a terrifying glimpse into a universe where the boundaries between life and death are porous, and where the physical remains of the holy operate under an alien, unrelenting physics. The implications of this event challenge everything we understand about the mortal vessel. But to truly comprehend how a dead man could command the forces of life from the grave, we must first look backward, unearthing the brutal historical context that the modern world has conveniently chosen to forget. We have been conditioned by centuries of sanitized religious art and softened theological discourse to view the prophets of the Old Testament through a fundamentally distorted lens. The modern Western mind naturally defaults to categorizing these figures as benevolent sages, grey-bearded moral philosophers standing on pastoral hillsides, delivering ethical platitudes and gentle warnings to a wayward population. This is a post-Enlightenment hallucination, a comfortable psychological barrier we have erected to protect ourselves from the raw, terrifying reality of the ancient Near East. In the unfiltered context of antiquity, the prophet was not a teacher. The original Hebrew texts do not frame them as men of mere words or religious instruction. The ancient, jagged word used to define their existence is Navi. To call someone a Navi was to identify them as a terrifying anomaly in the natural order. They were the authorized mouthpieces of the divine council, emissaries of the heavenly host possessing diplomatic immunity and lethal cosmic backing. A Navi was a living, breathing fracture in reality, a bridge between the visible realm of human politics and the invisible, highly volatile realm of Yahweh's court. When a prophet walked into a fortified city, kings did not seek their counsel. They trembled. The monarchs of antiquity understood that this individual walking through their gates was a flesh and blood containment unit for an alien power, a man who could overthrow entire dynasties with a single spoken pronouncement or call down localized atmospheric incineration upon an altar. To comprehend the absolute severity of Elisha's life, and ultimately the radioactive nature of his corpse, we must first aggressively strip away this mythological veneer and plunge ourselves into the geopolitical nightmare of the 9th century BCE. This was not an era of theological debate. It was an era of cosmic and physical slaughter. The northern kingdom of Israel was in a state of terminal, agonizing decay. The Omride dynasty, under the dark legacy of King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, had plunged the nation into a syncretic abyss. They had systematically attempted to merge the worship of the Israelite God with the blood-drenched, localized fertility cults of Canaan. This was the dark age of the Baal cycles, a time when child sacrifice, institutionalized temple prostitution, and the ritualistic mutilation of priests were not fringe heresies, but heavily funded, state-sponsored religious institutions. The spiritual architecture of the land was deeply corrupted, and the physical borders were bleeding out. The Moabite raiders mentioned casually in the scriptural account of the interrupted funeral were not a literary invention designed to inject artificial suspense into the narrative. They were a brutal, horrifying historical reality, one that is firmly corroborated by the secular archaeological record. In the late 19th century, excavators working in the ruins of ancient Dibon unearthed a massive basalt monument now known as the Mesha Stele, or the Moabite stone. Etched deeply into this black rock is the boastful, chilling account of King Mesha of Moab, detailing his violent and successful rebellion against the kingdom of Israel following the death of King Ahab. The stele coldly records the systematic slaughter of Israelite civilian populations, the triumphant dragging of Yahweh's sacred vessels into the dirt, and the dedication of conquered cities to the Moabite god Chemosh. This dedication was achieved through the horrific ritual of harem, the absolute uncompromising destruction of every living man, woman, and child as a blood offering to their deity. This was the dark, blood-soaked world that Elisha the prophet inhabited, a world where divine warfare was intensely territorial, deeply physical, and entirely merciless. The psychological toll of living in this environment was absolute. To be an Israelite farmer in the spring meant scanning the horizon every morning, knowing that a cloud of dust could signal the arrival of marauders who would butcher your family, burn your crops, and leave your unburied body to the scavenging birds. It is a level of sustained generational trauma that the modern mind can barely conceptualize. It is precisely within this theater of relentless war and spiritual contamination that we must violently reevaluate the ancient concept of holiness. Modern religious frameworks treat holiness almost exclusively as a moral category, a synonym for perfect ethical behavior, kindness, or spiritual purity. We have domesticated the divine. But in the ancient Hebrew consciousness, holiness, rooted deeply in the word Qadosh, was not primarily a behavioral trait. It was an objective, physical, and highly dangerous reality. It was an ontological state of being completely separate, fundamentally other, and entirely alien to the corrupted, decaying natural order of the material universe. Qadosh functioned more like cosmic radiation or a high-voltage electrical current than a moral philosophy. God's unmediated presence was understood as a consuming fire, an unapproachable, crushing weight of glory that would instantly disintegrate anything imperfect or impure that dared to come into direct contact with it. This terrifying physics of holiness is exactly why the ancient tabernacle and the later temple in Jerusalem required such exhausting, labyrinthine protocols of purification and blood sacrifice. The slaughter of bulls and goats, the exact uncompromising measurements of the heavy veil separating the Holy of Holies, the intricate bell-lined garments of the high priest, the blinding clouds of incense, these were not arbitrary religious ceremonies designed for aesthetic theater. They were deeply necessary protective countermeasures. They were spiritual hazmat suits and architectural shielding mechanisms designed to protect fragile human biology from the lethal, unshielded intensity of the divine presence residing over the Ark of the Covenant. We see the fatal mechanics of this unshielded holiness vividly demonstrated in the terrifying incident involving the Ark, recorded in the second book of Samuel, chapter 6. The Ark was the ultimate physical locus of Yahweh's presence on earth, functioning essentially as the localized footstool of the divine throne. When King David attempted to transport the Ark to Jerusalem, they placed it on a new wooden cart, flagrantly violating the strict Levite transport protocols outlined in the Torah, which demanded it be carried on poles by consecrated priests. As the procession moved forward, the oxen pulling the cart stumbled. A man named Uzzah, walking beside the cart, saw the most sacred object in the universe tipping toward the mud, likely acting out of pure, reflexive instinct to protect the sacred relic. Uzzah reached out his hand and grabbed the ark to steady it. The scripture records that the anger of the Lord burned against Uzzah, and God struck him down there for his irreverence, and he died instantly beside the ark of God. Uzzah did not have malicious intent. He was not committing a premeditated moral sin. He was not cursing the heavens or worshipping a foreign idol, but he was a mortal, imperfect man who, without the required ritual shielding and authorization, made direct, unmediated physical contact with the most concentrated localized source of Qadosh on the planet. The result was instantaneous, catastrophic biological failure. The holiness of God did not pause to judge his good intentions. It simply reacted to his unprotected presence, exactly as a live, high-voltage wire violently reacts to a grounded human conductor. It was a mechanical, lethal, and instantaneous transfer of pure energy that short-circuited his nervous system and stopped his heart. Now, we must take this terrifying, lethal physics of ancient holiness and map it directly onto the living, breathing biology of the prophet Elisha. In the Old Testament era, the Spirit of God did not permanently and gently indwell every common citizen, as is taught in later theological traditions. The ancient texts describe the interaction between the divine spirit and humanity in far more violent, overwhelming, and transient terms. The Hebrew scriptures frequently utilize vocabulary that indicates a sudden, almost terrifying possession. The Spirit of God would clothe itself with a person, as seen in the root labash, turning the fragile human host into an armored living weapon for divine action. Or the texts describe the Spirit rushing upon an individual, using the root salach, a deeply aggressive word that implies a forceful, tearing action, much like a predator falling heavily upon its prey, or an invisible supernatural hurricane slamming directly into the prophet's chest. When this happened, the human body was temporarily hijacked by a higher dimension. The nervous system was flooded with an alien force that enabled mortal men to tear lions apart with their bare hands, outrun heavily armored chariots in a torrential rainstorm, or manipulate the weather patterns of the entire Mediterranean coast. But this possession took a severe, agonizing toll on the human host. The prophet was a living conduit for a frequency of power that was fundamentally incompatible with decaying, carbon-based flesh. Elisha, however, was not merely a vessel for occasional transient bursts of this power. He was the absolute apex of prophetic concentration, the focal point of divine intervention in a dying kingdom. His initiation into the prophetic office was marked by a bizarre and legally binding cosmic transaction that defies modern logic. In the second book of Kings, chapter 2, right before his master, the legendary prophet Elijah, is forcefully abducted into the heavens by a localized atmospheric anomaly, described terrifyingly as a chariot of fire and horses of fire, a military escort from the divine council tearing through the fabric of space-time. Elisha makes a staggering, audacious demand. As Elijah prepares to depart, he asks his protege what he desires. Elisha looks at the man who called fire down from the sky and asks for a double portion of his spirit. When the modern mind reads this phrase, we assume Elisha was asking to be twice as powerful or twice as holy as his master. But the ancient Israelite reader understood exactly what was occurring in the text. Elisha was invoking strict legal terminology found in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 21, verse 17.
The Hebrew phrase he uses is pashnayim, which translates literally as a mouth of two. This was the specific, legally mandated inheritance right given exclusively to the firstborn son, entitling him to twice the physical inheritance of any other sibling. By demanding the pashnayim of Elijah's spirit, Elisha was not asking for a mere power boost or a magical upgrade. He was asserting his legal, binding right as the primary, unrivaled heir to Elijah's prophetic dynasty. He was boldly demanding to be recognized by the heavenly court as the absolute focal point of Yahweh's earthly jurisdiction in the northern kingdom. And the court answered. As Elijah was ripped into the storm, his rough mantle, his adoret, the physical, heavy cloak of his office, fell from the sky. Elisha picked it up, walked to the edge of the rushing Jordan River, and violently struck the water, screaming to the heavens to validate the cosmic contract. The waters tore apart, defying the laws of fluid dynamics, confirming that the transfer of authority was complete and absolute. From that very moment forward, Elisha's physical body became the undisputed geopolitical and spiritual epicenter of divine power on earth. For over 5 decades, Elisha's central nervous system, his bones, his blood volume, and his very cellular structure were subjected to the continuous, punishing flow of the Ruach HaKodesh. He did not just experience momentary fleeting bursts of power, he lived in a sustained state of hypersaturation. His sensory organs were permanently altered. He possessed a terrifying level of clairvoyance that allowed him to sit in his house in Israel and hear the whispered classified military strategies of foreign kings in their heavily guarded private bedchambers in Aram. When a massive Syrian army surrounded his city at Dothan to assassinate him, his servant descended into a panic. But Elisha simply prayed for the servant's eyes to be open to the true reality of their situation. The text reveals that Elisha's vision was constantly calibrated to a higher spectrum of reality. He could clearly see the invisible, blazing chariots of fire occupying the mountainside, a heavily armed angelic garrison standing ready, while ordinary men were entirely blind to the invisible war raging around them.
Elisha's physical proximity alone altered the molecular structure of the world around him. He neutralized lethal toxins in a boiling pot of stew by simply throwing in a handful of common flour, instantaneously rewriting the chemical composition of the poison on a molecular level. He manipulated the gravitational mass of a sunken iron axe head, forcing the heavy metal to break the laws of density and float to the surface of the Jordan River. And most terrifyingly, his body was repeatedly used as a living battery to jumpstart the dead. When the young son of the Shunammite woman died of a sudden brain aneurysm, Elisha did not merely pray from a distance. The text details a horrifyingly intimate mechanical transfer of life. He stretched his own living body over the cold, rigid corpse of the child, putting his mouth on the boy's mouth, his eyes on the boy's eyes, and his hands heavily upon the boy's hands. He laid there, forcing the divine current running through his own flesh directly into the dead tissue of the child, until the boy's flesh miraculously grew warm and the child violently sneezed 7 times, forcefully expelling death from his lungs. For half a century, the unyielding radioactive current of the divine ran relentlessly through Elisha's veins. He was a walking singularity, a man whose very biology was steeped in the terrifying power of the world to come.
Yet, despite this unfathomable, reality-bending power, the ancient biblical text records a deeply sobering, almost brutally cold reality regarding the end of his life. In the second book of Kings, chapter 13, verse 14, the scripture states with unflinching bluntness, "Now Elisha had fallen sick with the illness of which he was to die." The paradox is staggering.
The man who raised the dead, the man who cured Naaman, the Syrian military commander of terminal flesh-eating leprosy by simply ordering him to wash in the murky waters of the Jordan, was ultimately conquered by his own decaying biology. The lethal divine power that flowed through his nervous system for 50 years did not grant him physical immortality. It did not regenerate his failing organs. It did not shield him from the slow, agonizing collapse of the human machine. The raw, unfiltered reality of the text is that the ultimate prophet of life, the man who held the keys to the invisible realm, died of a mundane terminal disease. His body finally shut down. His heart stopped beating. The lungs that had breathed life into a dead child went permanently silent. He was placed in a dark limestone cavern, wrapped in burial shrouds, and left alone in the blackness to rot. This inescapable biological conclusion brings us face to face with the most terrifying paradox of his tomb. In the intricate theology of the ancient world, death was not simply viewed as a biological cessation. It was recognized as a virulent spiritual contaminant. The human corpse was the physical, rotting manifestation of the ancient curse of Eden, the ultimate visible victory of chaos, decay, and sin over the divine order of creation. The exhaustive laws of Levitical purity found in the Book of Numbers, specifically concerning Tumat Met, the impurity of the dead, were meticulously designed to cordon off this contamination. To touch a corpse was to become ritually dead yourself. You were banished from the camp, forbidden from approaching the sanctuary of the living God, until you underwent the bizarre and deeply mysterious purification ritual involving the ashes of a perfectly unblemished red heifer. By all traditional theological logic, by the very laws of the universe God had established, the moment Elisha's soul departed his physical body, his decaying flesh became an object of supreme, undeniable defilement. His bones were supposed to be nothing more than the tragic, impure, and silent remnants of a mortal vessel that had finally expired. But the modern, rational mind has vastly underestimated the lingering, architectural impact of divine saturation. We comfortably assume that when the prophet dies, the power simply evaporates, retreating back into the heavens from whence it came. We assume the vessel returns to a neutral, harmless state of mere calcium, marrow, and dust. We forget that in the physical universe, when a material object is exposed to unimaginable, crushing levels of radiation for decades, it does not simply become inert the moment the primary power source is removed. It absorbs the energy. It becomes fundamentally altered at an atomic level. it becomes dangerously radioactive itself, emitting power long after the reactor has been shut down. The narrative of the panicked Israelite burial party frantically throwing a dead man into Elisha's tomb is not merely a tale of an accidental, fortunate resurrection. It is a terrifying revelation about the persistence of the sacred. The bones of Elisha lying in the dirt were not just a monument to a dead prophet. They were a dormant, highly charged reservoir of ancient Qadosh. They were an unshielded anomaly buried beneath the earth, silently waiting in the suffocating darkness, humming with an energy that refused to die. The human mind desperately seeks clean, categorized boundaries. We want the sacred safely contained in the temple, the dead permanently locked in the grave, and the terrifying power of God neatly confined to the heavens. We build massive, comforting theological frameworks to reassure ourselves that the supernatural operates within safe, predictable, and manageable limits. We convince ourselves that the age of terrifying, unmediated contact with the divine ended when the last prophets closed their eyes. But the silent, dry bones lying in the pitch blackness of that forgotten cavern suggest a far more unsettling reality. They suggest that the power which forged the foundations of the universe does not politely vacate the physical realm simply because the biological host has expired. The energy remains. The divine current is still active, buzzing silently in the marrow, completely oblivious to the decay of the surrounding flesh, waiting in the dark for a catalyst to finally bridge the circuit. To fully grasp the sheer, unrelenting terror of what transpired in that subterranean crypt, we must first slow down the narrative and examine the exact micromechanics of the burial itself. The text of 2 Kings, chapter 13, verse 21, reads with a cold, almost clinical brevity, masking a chaotic, adrenaline-fueled nightmare occurring above ground. The Moabite raiding party is not a distant threat. They are an immediate, visible harbinger of slaughter, kicking up plumes of dust on the spring horizon. The Israelites carrying the anonymous corpse are gripped by the primal, overriding instinct of self-preservation. In the ancient Near East, the burial of the dead was a highly sacred, meticulously regulated process, deeply tied to the honor of the family and the sanctity of the land. A proper Israelite burial during the Iron Age Levant typically involved a rock-cut tomb carved into the limestone hillsides of the Central Highlands. These tombs were architectural representations of Sheol, the underworld. They contained carved benches, known as arcosolia, where the freshly deceased would be laid out with oils and spices to combat the immediate, sickening odor of putrefaction. The family would then leave the body to decompose in the dark for up to a year, an agonizing waiting period known as primary burial. Only after the flesh had entirely melted away from the skeleton would the family return, gather the dry bones, and place them into a communal repository within the tomb, fulfilling the ancient idiom of being gathered to one's ancestors. But this mourning party has no time for spices. They have no time to carefully lay the body on a carved bench, fold the burial shrouds, or recite the lamentations. The Moabite swords are minutes away from their throats. They are dragging a dead weight, desperate to discard it so they can flee for their lives. They spot an open burial cave, likely its heavy blocking stone, the golal, rolled away or missing. They do not peer inside to inspect the cavern. They simply drag the body to the threshold and, in an act of sheer, unadulterated panic, hurl the corpse into the blackness. Gravity violently takes over. The dead man falls through the dark, his lifeless limbs flailing helplessly in the heavy, stagnant air of the tomb. This is where the ancient Hebrew text employs a specific, highly charged verb that demands our absolute attention. The English translation politely states that the man was let down and touched the bones of Elisha. But the original Hebrew word used here is naga. This is not a gentle brush. It is not a careful, deliberate placement. Naga is a violent, dynamic verb. It means to strike, to reach violently, to collide with force, or to be stricken by an external power. It is the exact same root word used in the book of Genesis, when God strikes Pharaoh's household with severe plagues, and it is the same word used in Leviticus to describe the terrifying, highly contagious transmission of a leprous disease upon physical contact. The corpse did not simply rest against the prophet. It crashed into him. The dead flesh violently struck the dry, silent skeleton of Elisha. In that microsecond of physical collision, a catastrophic spiritual and biological shockwave detonated in the darkness, completely severing the foundational laws of the natural universe. To understand the terrifying impossibility of this event, we must dissect the anatomical and spiritual reality of the corpse that was thrown into the cave. According to ancient Hebrew anthropology, a living human being is a complex, tripartite fusion of elements. There is the basar, the physical carbon-based flesh, fragile and bound to the dust of the earth. There is the ruach, the animating breath or wind, the electrical current of life that originates from God. And there is the nephesh, often translated as the soul, but more accurately understood as the living, breathing essence of the individual, their consciousness, their appetite, their very throat. At the moment of death, this intricate architecture violently collapses. The ruach is recalled to the heavens. The engine is cut off. The nephesh is dragged downward, descending into the suffocating, shadowy abyss of Sheol, the underworld where the dead exist as mere echoes, cut off from the land of the living and the active presence of Yahweh. And the basar, the flesh, is abandoned to the horrifying, relentless machinery of biological decay. The man thrown into Elisha's tomb was already dead. The biological point of no return had been crossed. The cessation of his cardiovascular system had initiated a cascade of microscopic horrors. Without oxygen, his cells had begun to rupture, releasing toxic enzymes that cannibalize the body from the inside out in a process known as autolysis. Algor mortis had cooled his core temperature to match the damp, freezing air of the cave. The blood in his veins had permanently ceased to flow, settling heavily in the lowest points of his body under the pull of gravity, staining his skin with the dark, purplish bruising of livor mortis. Rigor mortis had locked his muscles into a rigid, unyielding paralysis. His nephesh was gone, trapped in the inescapable gravity well of Sheol. He was an empty, rotting vessel. But as his necrotic, paralyzed flesh collided with the bones of Elisha, the silent tomb transformed into the epicenter of an explosive, reality-bending cosmic anomaly. We must critically examine the skeletal remains of the prophet. We are conditioned to view bones as the ultimate symbol of death, the final, pathetic remnant of a defeated biology. But the ancient Hebrew linguistic framework reveals a terrifying depth to the concept of the skeleton. The Hebrew word for bone is etzem, but etzem does not merely refer to calcium and marrow. It is the exact same root word used for essence, substance, and the very core of a being's identity. When Adam looks at Eve in the Garden of Eden, he declares she is bone of my bones, using the root etzem to signify not just physical skeletal similarity, but an identical shared essence of being. The bones of a man were considered the indestructible architectural foundation of his existence, the ultimate concentrated repository of his true self. Elisha's etzem had spent over half a century heavily saturated, compressed and irradiated by the relentless, unmediated power of the Ruach HaKodesh. His bones had acted as the grounding rods for the localized, blinding presence of the divine counsel on earth. When his flesh finally failed and rotted away in the cave, the modern, rational assumption is that the power departed with his soul. But the terrifying reality of 2 Kings chapter 13 proves otherwise. The raw, unfiltered Qadosh, the lethal, consuming holiness of God, had literally calcified into the marrow of his skeleton. The bones of the prophet were not dead. They were a dormant, highly charged, autonomous divine battery, buried in the dirt, completely independent of Elisha's departed consciousness. When the dead flesh of the anonymous Israelite Naga violently struck, this radioactive skeletal core, a closed mechanical circuit of divine power, was instantly completed. The resulting resurrection was not a peaceful, gentle awakening. It was a violent, agonizing reversal of biological entropy. The text simply says he revived, using the Hebrew word chaya, which means to be given life, to be quickened, to be violently snatched back from the edge of destruction. But think of the terrifying microscopic mechanics required to achieve this. The immense, concentrated divine energy surging from Elisha's bones ripped through the dead man's flesh like a cosmic defibrillator. The toxic, cannibalizing enzymes of autolysis were instantly neutralized and reversed. The coagulated, settling blood in his veins was violently forced back into a liquid state as his heart, still and cold just milliseconds prior, was jolted into a massive concussive contraction. Oxygen rushed into collapsed, necrotic lungs. The rigid chemical lock of rigor mortis was shattered instantly, causing the man's limbs to thrash in the darkness as his nervous system was suddenly and violently rebooted by a power source completely alien to human biology. Simultaneously, in the unseen spiritual realm, a horrifying and unprecedented violation of cosmic borders occurred. The man's nephesh, already descending into the shadowy depths of Sheol, was abruptly and violently hooked by an inescapable gravitational force from the world above. The impenetrable iron gates of the underworld were temporarily bypassed as his soul was dragged backward across the veil, screaming back into the physical realm, and slammed back into a repaired, functional biological host. The dead man opened his eyes in the pitch blackness of the cave. He drew a massive, ragged breath of stale, dusty air. The text says he stood up on his feet. Imagine the sheer, unadulterated psychological terror of that moment. He is completely disoriented, his mind desperately trying to bridge the gap between his last living memory and the suffocating darkness he now inhabits. He is standing in a tomb. He is standing directly over the glowing, or at least highly charged, skeletal remains of the most terrifying prophet in Israelite history. Above him, outside the mouth of the cave, he can likely hear the muffled, distant screams of the Moabite raiders slaughtering his burial party, the very people who threw him into the dark. He has been violently ripped from the peaceful oblivion of the dead and forced back into a world of unimaginable violence, resurrected by a skeleton in a forgotten crypt. This event forces a catastrophic paradigm shift in how we understand the mechanics of biblical miracles. Throughout the entirety of the scriptural canon, resurrections are highly localized, tightly controlled events that require a specific, living mediator. When the great prophet Elijah resurrected the son of the widow of Zarephath, he did not just snap his fingers. The text in 1 Kings chapter 17 details an agonizing physical struggle. Elijah carried the boy to the upper room, laid him on his own bed, and stretched himself upon the child 3 separate times, crying out to Yahweh, actively wrestling with God in prayer to return the child's soul. When Elisha himself, while still alive, resurrected the son of the Shunammite woman, it required intense, localized physical contact and a prolonged period of pacing the floor, building up the divine current within his own living body before transferring it to the dead child. Even centuries later, when Jesus of Nazareth stood before the tomb of Lazarus, he loudly commanded the stone to be rolled away. He lifted his eyes to the heavens in vocal prayer, and he issued a loud, booming verbal command: "Lazarus, come out." In every single instance, the miraculous reversal of death requires a living agent. It requires consciousness. It requires a vocalized command, a desperate prayer, a human will acting as a conduit, pleading with the divine realm to intervene in the natural order. Except here. In the tomb of Elisha, there is no living mediator. There is no prayer. There is no invocation of the sacred name of Yahweh. There is no prophet stretching out his hands over the dead. Elisha's nephesh is gone. His consciousness is not actively deciding to heal this man. The skeleton is not forming words. The terrifying, inescapable conclusion is that this miracle was entirely mechanical. It was an automated, autonomous reaction of raw divine power. The holiness stored in the bones of the prophet reacted to the decaying impurity of the corpse the exact same way a white blood cell ruthlessly and automatically attacks a foreign pathogen in the bloodstream. The Qadosh of God is so aggressively hostile to the curse of death that when the two were forced into direct, unmediated physical contact, the power of life violently annihilated the presence of death upon impact, without requiring a conscious command from anyone. This realization terrified the ancient Jewish sages and historians who wrestled with this text centuries later. The extra-biblical literature reveals a deep, lingering awe regarding the radioactive nature of Elisha's remains. In the apocryphal book of Sirach, also known as Ecclesiasticus, written in the early 2nd century BCE, the author, Jesus ben Sira, meticulously catalogues the legendary heroes of the Israelite faith. When he reaches the legacy of Elisha, he writes in chapter 48, verses 12 through 14, Elisha was filled with Elijah's spirit. During his life, no ruler could shake him, and no one could subdue him. Nothing was too hard for him, and when he was dead, his body prophesied. As in his life he did wonders, so in death his deeds were marvelous. Notice the chilling vocabulary Ben Sira uses. He does not simply say Elisha's bones performed a miracle. He states that his dead body prophesied. In the ancient Hebrew mindset, a prophecy was not merely a verbal prediction of the future. A prophecy was an eruption of divine truth, a physical manifestation of the heavenly reality breaking into the earthly dimension. The resurrection of the anonymous man was a silent, violent, and undeniable prophecy enacted by a skeleton. It was a localized, terrifying preview of the end of days, a physical demonstration that the ultimate, inescapable power of Yahweh is not bound by the biological limitations of his servants. The ancient Jewish commentators debated fiercely over this text. The Talmudic sages in Tractate Sanhedrin discussed the mechanics of this event, marveling at the fact that Elisha, in death, fulfilled the demand he made in life. He asked for a double portion of Elijah's spirit. Elijah raised one person from the dead during his ministry. Elisha raised one person while he was alive, and terrifyingly, raised a second person after he had already been reduced to dry bones, mathematically fulfilling the cosmic contract of the Pai Shnayim, the double portion from beyond the grave. But this deeply mechanical, automated view of divine power creates an agonizing theological crisis. We are forced to ask unanswerable, deeply disturbing questions. If the bones of the prophet contained such lethal, concentrated, life-giving power, why did Elisha die of a sickness in the first place? Why did the Ruach HaKodesh, which was heavily saturated in his marrow, not heal his own failing biology? Why did the power only activate when struck by an external alien corpse? Furthermore, what happened to the bones of Elisha after this event? The biblical text goes entirely dark. It offers no comforting epilogue. We do not know if the resurrected man ran out of the cave screaming, or if he carefully gathered the bones of the prophet and hid them. We do not know if the Israelites, realizing the terrifying radioactive power of the tomb, sealed it off, turning it into a forbidden, highly guarded containment zone. The silence of the scripture is deafening, and it leaves us staring into an abyss of divine architecture that we are utterly unequipped to understand. If the power of God can act autonomously, if it can calcify into physical matter and operate completely independently of human prayer or consciousness, it means that the supernatural realm is not a distant, passive dimension waiting to be invoked. It is a heavy, volatile, and highly dangerous substance woven directly into the physical dirt of the earth. It suggests that there are localized zones of reality, buried in forgotten caves and ruined tombs, where the laws of physics are fundamentally permanently broken, and where the raw, unshielded power of the world to come is still humming in the dark, patiently waiting for something dead to strike it. And this realization shatters the foundational doctrines of how humanity is supposed to interact with the divine, forcing us to confront a horrifying truth about the suppression of this knowledge. This terrifying realization that the supreme, life-giving power of the Creator can operate as a blind mechanical force anchored to human calcium creates a catastrophic collision with everything we think we know about mainstream biblical theology. We have been carefully taught, through centuries of sanitized religious curriculum, to view Yahweh exclusively as a God of profound relationship, deliberate covenant, and conscious, active dialogue. In the orthodox framework of the mind, miracles are the direct result of a highly specific transaction. A prophet falls to his knees, he rends his garments, he vocalizes a desperate plea, and the heavens actively decide to respond to his moral standing and his faith. It is a system built on intention, obedience, and the conscious mediation of a living human agent. But the pitch-black cavern of Elisha's tomb shatters this comforting, relational architecture into 1,000 jagged pieces. The resurrection of the anonymous Israelite was not born of repentance. It was not triggered by a faithful prayer. It was not the result of a divine dialogue. It was a brutal, physical collision of opposing states of matter. It was a closed-circuit detonation of raw, unshielded holiness reacting autonomously to the presence of biological decay. And it is precisely this chilling autonomy that terrified the early architects of Christian orthodoxy and the ancient rabbinic compilers of the Talmud. When the early church fathers and the sages stared into the depths of 2 Kings chapter 13, they recognized a theological abyss that threatened to consume the very foundations of their faith. They understood that if the masses truly comprehended the implications of this event, if the common, desperate peasantry believed that the lethal, world-altering power of God could be permanently trapped in a rotting human skeleton, completely independent of moral purity or active prayer, religion would instantly devolve into a frantic, blood-soaked scramble for magical artifacts. The worship of the invisible sovereign God would be rapidly replaced by the dark, desperate hoarding of radioactive human remains. We see this exact, horrifying human tendency to weaponize and commodify divine energy, vividly documented in the New Testament, in the 8th chapter of the book of Acts. The text introduces a man known as Simon Magus, an ancient and highly influential sorcerer, steeped in the deep magical traditions of the Samaritans. Simon witnesses the apostles, Peter and John, acting as biological conduits, transferring the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, to believers through the physical mechanism of laying on hands. Simon's reaction is not one of spiritual repentance or a desire for a covenantal relationship with the divine. His reaction is that of a cold, calculating architect of the occult. He views the apostles merely as biological containers for a highly volatile, immensely valuable cosmic energy. He literally pulls out silver and attempts to purchase the franchise rights to this power. He wants the mechanics of the miracle without the submission to the covenant. The Apostle Peter's reaction is violently hostile, telling Simon that his silver should perish with him in the fires of hell for daring to think the gift of God could be acquired through a mechanical transaction. The early church had to violently, relentlessly crush the idea that the power of God could be manipulated, bought, or distributed like a commercial commodity. Yet the terrifying anomaly of Elisha's bones stands as a silent, unyielding witness that, under highly specific, undocumented conditions, the power of God does, in fact, operate mechanically. It is a paradox they could not easily resolve, a glitch in the spiritual matrix that they preferred to leave buried in a single, rapid-fire verse, rather than deeply expound upon. To understand exactly why the location of Elisha's cavern was ultimately lost to history, why it was essentially suppressed and erased by the very people it was meant to protect, we must examine the tragic, relentless history of another highly charged mechanical divine artifact, the bronze serpent. In the book of Numbers, during the agonizing wandering in the wilderness, the Israelites are struck by a plague of venomous serpents, a divine judgment for their rebellion. God commands Moses to forge a bronze serpent and mount it high on a pole. The instructions are jarringly simple and entirely mechanical. Anyone who is bitten by a venomous snake only has to physically look at the bronze figure, and the lethal, coagulating venom in their veins is instantly neutralized. It was a localized, automated cure provided by the mercy of Yahweh, requiring no complex sacrifices, only a physical line of sight. But what did humanity do with this miraculous mechanism? They did not return it to God. They did not retire it with reverence once the plague ended. They kept it for centuries.
They dragged it into the Promised Land, and they allowed their inherent, desperate need for physical control over the supernatural to warp their theology. Fast forward hundreds of years to the second book of Kings, chapter 18, verse 4. The biblical text reveals that the Israelites had taken this sacred artifact, this historical conduit of divine healing, and mutated it into a dark, idolatrous obsession. They named the object Nehushtan, and they were actively burning incense to it, worshipping the bronze mechanism itself rather than the sovereign creator who had temporarily empowered it. The spiritual contamination was so severe that the righteous King Hezekiah had to violently smash the ancient relic into pieces, destroying a priceless piece of history simply to break the back of the idolatry. This is exactly the dark, inevitable fate that awaited the bones of Elisha. This is why the text abruptly goes dark after the resurrection, offering no comforting epilogue about the preservation of the tomb. Imagine the absolute geopolitical and spiritual chaos if the exact coordinates of a guaranteed mechanical resurrection chamber were known to the ancient Near East. The cavern would have transformed overnight from a place of silent divine sovereignty into the most dangerous blood-soaked piece of real estate on the planet. Kings would not have sought the counsel of living prophets. They would have waged apocalyptic genocidal wars to control access to the cave. Armies would have exhumed the bones, encasing the skeleton in gold and iron, carrying the remains of the prophet into battle as an ultimate, undefeatable insurance policy against slaughter. Desperate, grieving parents would have bypassed the altars of Yahweh, dragging the rotting corpses of their children into the dark, frantically smashing their lifeless bodies against the skeleton of the prophet, violently demanding the mechanism to trigger just one more time. The cavern would have rapidly devolved into a horrific temple of ancient necromancy, a place where humanity attempted to hold the power of life and death hostage. And this brings us to the absolute core of the doctrinal paradox, a tension so severe it threatens to tear the fabric of biblical law apart. The Torah strictly, uncompromisingly forbids any interaction with the dead. The Hebrew word used for this abomination is darash, specifically darash el hamitim, to violently seek out, to inquire of, or to attempt to utilize the dead. The book of Deuteronomy explicitly states that anyone who performs darash on a corpse is an absolute abomination to Yahweh, an act that guarantees immediate spiritual severance from the community of Israel. The spiritual architecture of the universe demands a strict, impenetrable quarantine between the living and the dead, a boundary that humanity is never permitted to cross. This terrifying prohibition is vividly and tragically illustrated in 1 Samuel chapter 28, when a desperate, terrified King Saul, abandoned by God and facing annihilation by the Philistine armies, visits the Witch of Endor. Saul forces the medium to perform an illicit, dark ritual, tearing a forbidden hole in the cosmic fabric to drag the spirit of the deceased prophet Samuel up from the shadows of Sheol. When Samuel's spirit appears, breaking through the crust of the earth, he is not a benevolent guide offering comfort from the beyond. He is furious. The text describes him as a divine being, an Elohim, rising from the ground. He coldly informs Saul that because he has dared to disturb the dead, because he has committed the ultimate violation of darash, Saul and his sons will be slaughtered in battle the very next day, and their souls will join him in the abyss. To reach across the veil, to attempt to utilize the dead for human gain, is a cosmic crime of the highest order, punishable by absolute destruction. Here lies the staggering, unanswerable impasse. If darash, the physical and spiritual seeking of the dead, is the ultimate abomination, what exactly happened in Elisha's tomb? The frightened Israelites dragged a corpse into a grave and violently threw it onto the skeleton of a dead prophet. By the strictest definitions of Levitical law, they were interacting with the dead. They were mixing the ultimate impurity of a fresh corpse with the remains of a revered ancestor. According to the precedent set by Saul and the Witch of Endor, the earth should have opened up and swallowed the burial party alive. A curse of unparalleled severity should have fallen upon the land. But instead of a curse, instead of instant divine execution,
They were granted the most profound, impossible, and spectacular miracle in the physical universe: life from death. The orthodox, rational mind screams for a clean resolution to this contradiction. It demands a theological footnote, a neatly packaged explanation that categorizes this event without violating the ironclad laws of Moses. But the biblical text refuses to comply. It offers no apology. It offers no defense. It simply states the terrifying fact of the resurrection and moves on, leaving us staring into an abyss of divine architecture that we are utterly unequipped to navigate. To even begin to comprehend how this paradox exists, we must push past the surface level of Sunday school theology and delve into the ancient, terrifying Hebrew distinction between the two manifestations of God's presence, the panim and the kavod. The human mind, fragile and easily broken, is designed only to interface with the panim, which translates literally to the face or the presence of God. This is the relational, communicative aspect of the divine. This is the aspect of Yahweh that speaks from the burning bush, that issues the 10 Commandments, that negotiates covenants with Abraham, and that allows Moses to intercede on behalf of a rebellious nation. The panim is terrifying in its majesty, but it possesses intent, personality, and a willingness to engage in dialogue that can be somewhat processed by human intellect. We want the face. We crave the relationship. But the pitch-black space inside Elisha's tomb is entirely devoid of the panim. The prophet is dead. There is no voice to mediate the power. There is no dialogue, no negotiation, no relational presence. What remains anchored to those dry bones is not the face of God, but the raw, unshielded, heavy kavod. The original Hebrew root for kavod is often translated as glory, but that word has been diluted by modern usage into something resembling a bright, shiny light. In its ancient context, kavod literally translates to weight, heaviness, or an unbearable, crushing mass. It is the raw, gravitational, ontological reality of God's absolute supremacy. When the kavod fills the newly constructed temple in the days of King Solomon, the text in 1 Kings chapter 8 specifically notes that the priests could not even stand on their feet to minister. They were physically pinned to the stone floor, completely incapacitated by the sheer, atmospheric density of the divine weight pressing down upon them. The kavod does not negotiate. It does not speak. It does not care about human comfort. It simply is. It is the ultimate, uncompromising reality of the universe, a localized concentration of the power that holds atoms together and tears galaxies apart. When the decaying, impure flesh of the dead man struck Elisha's bones, it was not meeting the panim of God in a tender moment of divine mercy. The dead man did not receive a vision. He did not hear a voice calling him back. His rotting tissue violently collided with the dormant, heavy kavod of God that had permanently fused with the calcium of the prophet. It was a purely physical reaction between the ultimate source of life and the ultimate manifestation of the curse. The kavod obliterated the death in the man's cells not out of pity, but out of absolute, uncompromising hostility to the presence of decay. It was a violent, mechanical correction of reality. This mechanical bypass of standard spiritual protocols forces us to reconsider the unseen, highly bureaucratic structure of the spiritual realm. According to ancient texts like the Book of Enoch and the apocalyptic visions of Daniel, the invisible dimension is not a chaotic, free-flowing environment. It is a highly structured, fiercely guarded hierarchy governed by strict jurisdictions, territorial watchers, and legal decrees. The transition of a human soul from the land of the living to the realm of the dead is a closely monitored, legally binding process. The angel of death, often associated in ancient Jewish literature with the figure of Samael or the Mashchit, the destroying angel mentioned during the Passover in Exodus, holds a legally binding warrant over every human soul that crosses the threshold of mortality. Once the cardiovascular system permanently ceases, the human nephesh is technically and legally the undisputed property of Sheol. The iron gates of the underworld are locked behind the descending soul, and the spiritual paperwork is filed in the heavenly court. To release a soul from the gravity well of Sheol, to To break those iron gates requires a supreme, direct, and explicit override code from the highest throne of Yahweh. We see this explicit command utilized centuries later when Christ stands before the tomb of Lazarus and shouts with a loud, booming voice, issuing a verbal, authoritative command that legally forces the underworld to relinquish its prisoner. But in the silent, suffocating darkness of Elisha's tomb, there was no command issued from the heavens. There was no mediator pleading the case in the divine court. The dormant kavod, acting autonomously in the dirt of the earth, effectively bypassed the entire spiritual chain of command. It hijacked the legal jurisdiction of the underworld on contact, ripping the soul back across the veil without a single word being spoken. This is the ultimate, hidden battle that the text forces us to acknowledge. It is not just a battle between life and death on a biological level. It is a terrifying revelation about the uncontrollable, sovereign nature of God's power. We desperately want to believe that we understand the rules of engagement. We want to believe that if we follow the right steps, pray the right words, and avoid the right sins, the supernatural realm will behave in a predictable, safe manner. We construct massive, intricate theological fortresses to convince ourselves that God is safely confined within the parameters of our understanding. But the bones of Elisha stand as a grim, silent monument to the fact that Yahweh cannot be boxed in by human theology, nor is his power entirely restricted by the biological cessation of his chosen vessels. The suppression of this narrative, the reason it is glossed over in modern pulpits, is driven by a profound existential fear. If we fully accept the terrifying mechanics of what happened in that cave, we must accept that we live in a universe where the power of the Creator is so unimaginably vast, so infinitely potent, that it can literally spill over, pool up, and saturate the physical objects of the material world. We must accept the existence of localized hazard zones of grace and terror, where the laws of physics are permanently fractured, and where the raw, unshielded energy of the world to come hums silently in the dark. It suggests that the line between the physical and the spiritual is not a thick, impenetrable wall, but a fragile, porous membrane that can be violently ruptured by simply throwing a dead man into the wrong hole in the ground. And as we move forward into the prophetic implications of this anomaly, we must ask ourselves a deeply unsettling question. If this power existed then, heavily concentrated in the bones of a single man, what does it mean for the architecture of the spiritual war that rages around us today? The anomaly in Elisha's tomb was never meant to be viewed as an isolated historical accident. It was a prototype. It was a localized, violent demonstration of the ultimate irreversible destiny of the entire physical universe. We look at the ground beneath our feet and we see the final resting place of billions, a silent planetary graveyard where biology has ultimately surrendered to the inescapable mathematics of entropy. We view the dirt as the ultimate conqueror, but the forces operating in the unseen dimensions, the principalities and powers navigating the invisible architecture of our world, know the terrifying truth. They know that the Earth is not a cemetery. It is a highly pressurized, planetary-scale containment grid. It is a staggering reservoir of dormant hardware, seeded with the physical remains of humanity, quietly waiting for a specific cosmic frequency to trigger a catastrophic, synchronized reanimation. To comprehend the true nature of the ongoing spiritual war that surrounds us in the modern era, we must radically shift our understanding of why the demonic realm is so relentlessly, obsessively fixated on human biology. The ancient texts, particularly the Book of Enoch and the teachings of Christ in the Gospel of Matthew, reveal a horrifying reality about the disembodied entities wandering the earth. They are spirits stripped of physical form, doomed to roam through arid, desolate places, seeking a vessel, seeking rest, and finding none. They suffer a perpetual, agonizing starvation for physical interaction with the material world. But their obsession with the human body is not merely about experiencing sensory pleasure or inflicting physical pain. It is driven by a deep, cosmic terror of what the human form actually represents. The fallen entities witnessed the creation of Adam. They know that carbon-based human flesh, despite its fragility and its susceptibility to disease, was the only physical substance in the universe specifically engineered to act as a permanent, high-capacity containment vessel for the kavod, the heavy, crushing glory of God. They look at our bones, and they do not see fragile calcium. They see the exact same biological circuitry that allowed Elisha to carry the atmospheric pressure of heaven, the same dormant architecture that successfully rebooted a dead man in the dark. The demonic agenda is a desperate, preemptive strike. They seek to corrupt, defile, and mutate the human vessel, attempting to sabotage the biological hardware before the final, inescapable signal is sent from the divine throne. This terrifying concept of an indestructible physical blueprint buried within the human frame was fiercely guarded by the ancient Jewish mystics and sages. In the deep, esoteric volumes of the Midrash Rabbah, specifically within the commentary on Leviticus, there is a profound and unsettling historical record detailing a confrontation between the brutal logic of the Roman Empire and the impenetrable mysteries of Hebrew theology. The Roman Emperor Hadrian, a man who possessed the ultimate power of life and death over the known world, demanded that Rabbi Joshua ben Hananiah explain exactly how the God of Israel intended to reconstruct the decayed, pulverized billions of the human race at the end of days. Hadrian understood death as absolute annihilation, but Rabbi Joshua revealed the terrifying secret of the luz. The ancient tradition states that there is a singular, microscopic bone at the absolute base of the human spine, known as the luz. It is the core architectural anchor of human existence. The Midrash records that this tiny fragment of the skeleton defies all the laws of natural physics and thermodynamics. The rabbis taught that if you placed the luz upon a blacksmith's anvil and struck it with a heavy iron hammer, the anvil would shatter and the hammer would split, but the bone would remain completely undamaged. If you threw it into a blazing furnace, it would not burn. If you dropped it into a vat of corrosive acid, it would not dissolve. The luz is the indestructible seed of the human machine, the immutable kernel of our physical identity that absorbs the divine blueprint and waits in the darkness of the earth. When the final trumpet sounds, the ancient sages claimed, God will simply release the exact atmospheric frequency of the Ruach over the earth, and the dew of resurrection will fall. The loose bone will instantly react, serving as the biological cornerstone from which the entire skeletal structure, the nervous system, and the flesh will violently and rapidly rebuild itself. This is not mere folklore. It is the theological undercurrent that sets the stage for the most terrifying eschatological vision in the entirety of the Old Testament. In the 37th chapter of the book of Ezekiel, the prophet is forcibly abducted by the Spirit of the Lord and dropped directly into the center of a massive, desolate valley. The text is brutal in its description. The valley is filled with human bones. They are completely dry. They have been bleaching in the sun for decades, completely stripped of any residual moisture or biological material. This is a landscape of absolute, irreversible defeat. The Lord asks Ezekiel a question designed to break the human mind. He asks, "Son of man, can these bones live?" Ezekiel, fully aware of the lethal, unpredictable mechanics of divine power, refuses to answer with human logic. He simply says, "O Lord God, you know." What follows is a terrifying planetary-scale expansion of the exact same mechanical override that occurred in Elisha's crypt. God commands Ezekiel not to pray, but to prophesy directly to the calcium. He is ordered to speak to the dead matter itself. As the prophet opens his mouth and issues the command, the silence of the valley is suddenly shattered by a sound that the Hebrew text identifies as a ra'ash. English translations often render this weakly as a noise or a rattling. But ra'ash is a catastrophic word. It is the exact terminology used for a violent tectonic earthquake, a literal shaking of the foundations of the earth. It is the sound of the natural laws of physics violently collapsing under the weight of an alien dimension. Imagine the sheer, deafening horror of that moment. Millions of dry, scattered bones suddenly begin to vibrate, moving autonomously across the dirt, violently snapping together to form perfect interlocking skeletal frameworks. The air temperature plummets as the atmosphere is suddenly choked with the smell of newly forged biological matter. Tendons shoot across the joints like living steel cables. Muscles violently weave themselves over the bones, and skin stretches rapidly across the newly formed faces of a massive, silent, dead army. But they are still corpses. The biological hardware has been reassembled, but the engine is completely silent. Then comes the second command: prophesy to the breath. And the Ruach, the exact same heavy, volatile electrical current that had saturated Elisha's living veins, slams into the valley like an invisible, supernatural hurricane. Millions of dead men open their eyes in perfect synchronization. The ground trembles as an exceedingly great army stands on its feet. This vision is not an abstract metaphor for the political restoration of a nation. It is a stark, terrifying blueprint of the eschatological future. It is a guarantee that the physical mechanics of resurrection are already encoded into the fabric of reality, waiting for the final countdown. We see this cosmic countdown reach its horrifying climax in the New Testament, in the apocalyptic visions recorded by the Apostle John in the 11th chapter of the book of Revelation. The text introduces two deeply mysterious, virtually indestructible prophets, known as the Two Witnesses. These men operate with the exact same terrifying, highly volatile authority as Elisha and Elijah. They are given the power to shut up the sky so that it will not rain, to turn the oceans into blood, and to strike the earth with every conceivable plague as often as they desire. For 3.5 years, their physical bodies act as the unshielded containment vessels for the raw wrath of the divine council. The entire political and military apparatus of the earth is completely powerless against them. Anyone who attempts to harm them is instantly incinerated by fire pouring directly from the prophets' mouths. They are untouchable, living weapons of mass destruction walking the streets of a dying world. But then, the unthinkable occurs. The abyss is opened, and a demonic entity described as the Beast ascends from the subterranean depths. This entity is granted temporary, terrifying authorization to overcome the two witnesses. The biological hardware of the prophets is finally broken. They are assassinated in the streets of the great city. What the global population does next is highly indicative of the dark, twisted psychology of humanity. They do not bury the bodies. They refuse to place the prophets in a tomb. They leave the corpses lying on the asphalt, rotting in the open air for 3.5 days, while the inhabitants of the earth celebrate, gaze upon the dead flesh, and exchange gifts in a perverse, global festival of relief. The world believes that the mechanics of the divine have finally been defeated. They believe that death has asserted its ultimate authority over the mouthpieces of Yahweh. The corpses begin to stiffen. The blood begins to settle. The biological process of autolysis is well underway, visible to every camera and every eye on the planet. And then, the global broadcast captures an event that shatters the minds of billions. After 3.5 days, the text of Revelation utilizes a deeply specific, terrifying Greek phrase. It states that the pneumozoes entered them. This is not a gentle symbolic wind. Pneumozoes is the violent, electrical breath of life itself, a cosmic shockwave sent directly from the throne room of the universe. It is the exact same autonomous mechanical override that jolted the anonymous Israelite in Elisha's cave. But now, it is occurring on a planetary stage, broadcast to a terrified global audience. The rotting flesh of the two prophets violently reconstructs itself. Their hearts restart with a concussive thud. The rigor mortis is instantly shattered. They stand upon their feet, and a voice from the sky booms, commanding them to ascend. As they ascend into the clouds, the earth experiences a massive tectonic event, a physical earthquake that instantly slaughters 7,000 people in the city below. The resurrection is directly accompanied by catastrophic geographical destruction, proving once again that the divine power of life is so unimaginably heavy, so dense with the reality of the world to come, that the fragile crust of the earth literally cracks under its weight. This is the profound eschatological terror that we are currently living under. The events documented in 2 Kings, the visions of Ezekiel, the prophecies of Revelation, they are not disconnected theological concepts. They are a continuous, escalating revelation of the forbidden mechanics of the universe. We walk every day over a thin crust of dirt, completely oblivious to the fact that the earth is heavily saturated with the remnants of the holy, the blood of the martyrs, and the microscopic, indestructible loose bones of billions waiting in the dark. The invisible war raging around us right now, the unseen battles fought by angelic princes and demonic principalities, are not merely philosophical disagreements about morality. They are violent, territorial disputes over the control of human biology, fought on the very precipice of the final cosmic command. The demonic realm operates in a state of perpetual panic, because they know the physics of the resurrection are absolute. They know that every single grave is essentially a sleeper cell, a dormant biological weapon waiting for the pneumozoes to bridge the circuit. They know that the power that flowed through Elisha's bones is not locked away in a distant, unapproachable heaven. It is woven into the very fabric of the dirt, a lingering, volatile frequency that refuses to dissipate. The air we breathe is thick with the anticipation of an impending, catastrophic reversal of all physical laws. The modern church may have forgotten the sheer, lethal severity of God's interaction with the physical world, choosing instead to focus on a sanitized, comfortable spirituality. But the entities dwelling in the shadows have not forgotten. They remember the violent shaking of the valley. They remember the blind panic of the Moabite raiders. They remember the sheer, unadulterated terror of watching a rotting corpse stand up in the pitch blackness of a forgotten tomb, rebooted by a power that required no permission and offered no apology. The universe is a tightly wound spring, a mechanical construct pushed to the absolute breaking point, waiting for the singular, devastating frequency that will tear the sky apart and force the earth to violently vomit up its dead. The boundaries are failing. The ancient architecture of death is shaking, and as we stand on the edge of the eschaton, staring into the dark, yawning mouth of a reality we are completely unequipped to survive, we are forced to realize that the dead are not actually gone. They are simply waiting in the dark for the circuit to close. The modern human condition is an elaborate, heavily fortified exercise in mass delusion. We construct our towering cities of glass and steel, we insulate ourselves with digital noise, and we meticulously sanitize the biological reality of death, reducing it to a quiet, invisible medical procedure hidden behind sterile hospital curtains. We do this because we are desperate to forget what we are. We are desperate to convince ourselves that we are the sovereign architects of our own destiny, safely removed from the brutal, unyielding mechanics of the ancient universe. We look at the sky and project our own fragile human emotions onto the divine, constructing a theological idol of a God who is endlessly accommodating, infinitely tolerant, and primarily concerned with our emotional fulfillment. We have completely forgotten the terror of the sacred. The ancient Hebrew consciousness did not suffer from this delusion. They understood their exact place in the cosmic hierarchy, and it was a place defined by absolute, paralyzing vulnerability. The language they used to describe their interaction with the Creator centers heavily on the concept of yira. In modern, diluted translations, yira is often rendered as mere reverence or a polite religious respect. This is a catastrophic mistranslation of the ancient psyche. Yira is existential dread. It is the primal biological terror that grips a fragile organism when it suddenly realizes it is standing completely unprotected in the presence of an infinitely superior, unstoppable force. It is the same terror a man feels when standing at the edge of an erupting volcano or staring into the eye of a massive hurricane. In the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 4, verse 24, Moses delivers a chilling, architectural definition of the divine nature, stating plainly, Yahweh your God is an Esh Okla, a consuming fire. A fire does not negotiate, it does not compromise, it does not feel empathy for the combustible material it encounters. It simply consumes according to its merciless elemental nature. To approach an Esh Okla covered in the combustible, decaying impurity of human flesh is an act of sheer madness,
unless one is shielded by strict, legally binding covenantal blood. This terrifying vulnerability is the ultimate crushing thesis of the ancient philosophical text known as Ecclesiastes. The author, identified as the Koheleth, the assembler of dark truths, strips away every comforting human illusion about legacy, power, and permanence. The Koheleth observes the cyclical, uncaring machinery of the universe and concludes that all human endeavor is hevel, a vapor, a meaningless chasing after the wind. But it is in the 12th chapter that the text delivers its final, inescapable verdict on the human machine. The poetry is brutal and fatalistic. The silver cord is severed, the golden bowl is broken, the pitcher is shattered at the spring, and the wheel broken at the well. And then, in verse 7, the Koheleth documents the final cold mechanical shutdown of the human host. The dust returns to the ground it came from, and the Ruach returns to God who gave it. We are not the masters of our own existence. We are merely leased biological vessels, temporarily inflated by a heavy, volatile electrical current that does not belong to us. And when the lease expires, the current is violently recalled, and the carbon shell is abandoned to the dirt. The anomaly of Elisha's tomb strips away our final, most desperate comfort. We deeply want to believe that the grave is a sanctuary, a quiet neutral zone where we are finally beyond the reach of divine severity. We assume that death is the one boundary that provides absolute shelter from the terrifying demands of the Creator. But the dark, silent cavern in the ancient Levant proves that there is no neutral ground anywhere in the architecture of reality. The dirt beneath our feet is heavily weaponized. The laws of biology and physics, the very rules we rely upon to make sense of our mortal existence, are merely temporary suggestions, easily and violently overwritten by the lingering, radioactive kavod of a God who refuses to be confined to the heavens. Elisha's bones are a monument to the terrifying reality that the power of God is not abstract. It is a physical, heavy, lethal force that anchors itself to reality and operates with a cold, autonomous logic that we can neither control nor fully comprehend. We are standing on the precipice of eternity, cloaked in rotting flesh, blindly navigating a universe governed by an alien, uncompromising holiness. There is no safe distance. There is no philosophical shelter. When the final frequency hums through the bedrock of the earth, the dust will obey, the bones will shatter the stone, and every fragile human illusion will be instantly incinerated by the consuming fire of the world to come. We are born in the dark, we return to the dark, and we are utterly, inescapably, at the mercy of the power that dwells within it.